Welcome. As is customary with Buddhist teachings, we begin with going for refuge and setting our motivation for the teachings, for doing the practice. Within the broad range of Buddhist teachings and Buddhist practices, going to teachings and studying sutras and reciting sutras are all valid forms of practice in their own right. So practicing Buddhism is not limited to meditation practice or reciting a mantra or something like that. Coming to a teaching and participating in a gathering is a form of Buddhist practice. And we always begin with setting refuge, going for refuge and setting motivation. When I go for refuge, I like to think about what refuge means to me. When I'm doing more of like a liturgy or a daily practice, I will recite a refuge prayer, which is quite customary. I recite a refuge prayer in English, but you'll also hear them in Tibetan, Sanskrit, or Chinese, depending on what type of Buddhist community you're hanging around in. But I like to think of the sort of philosophical principles of Buddhism as much as the sort of ritual practices and the meditation practices. So when I think of going for refuge, this word refuge is kind of an unusual word in English. I was thinking the other day about when do we actually see this word refuge sort of in our daily life. And I remember the last time I saw it was at a school building where there was a big sign that said area of refuge. And, I, of course, immediately saw that as like a Buddhist metaphor. But it was like a concrete bunker and with really thick walls. So it was like a place where you could go if there was an earthquake or a fire. And if you can't evacuate, it was a building kind of on the edge of town, this sort of rural-urban interface. So that it's like on the edge of a wilderness land. And so if there's a fire out there, you can't necessarily leave the building if it comes through quickly, as we've been seeing in California a lot this year and the last few years. So this area of refuge was a place that you could go, kind of a bomb shelter situation where if you hang out in that space, you'll be protected from whatever natural disasters befall you. And of course, in Buddhism, the disaster is samsara, the disaster we make of our lives through ignorance and planting negative karma through selfish and mean-spirited actions, big and small actions that we do. But the longer we practice, we hopefully commit fewer harmful actions with our bodies, but also with our speech, the things that we say, and even in our thoughts. So when we're going for refuge from Buddhism, what we're seeking shelter from is samsara, the sort of mistakes that we make through ignorance, motivated by ignorance. The three poisons in Buddhism, of course, are craving, aversion, and delusion. Sometimes that's put as greed, hatred, and delusion. So it's, inappropriately wanting things, thinking that they're going to make us happy, or inappropriately thinking that if we get rid of something, it'll help make us happy. And so craving and delusion are sort of the manifestations of ignorance, which is not really understanding how the world is working. And this is what we're going to the three jewels, Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha, to seek refuge from. And so when we go for refuge to the Buddha, we're not asking Buddha to intercede on our behalf or sort of like come out of his Buddha heaven and rearrange things for us to get us out of our jam. That's not how Buddhas work, and that's not how Buddhist philosophy thinks about what our options are. So we're not praying to Buddha to come and help us out, but we are going to refuge to Buddha as the sort of ideal state of consciousness, the pinnacle state of humanity, which is or of all life, really, not just humanity, that we have the capacity to fundamentally change the way that our mind is working, fundamentally change our perception, and realize a state of consciousness that is not afflicted by suffering, that is not ever doing things that harm people, and are always, in fact, doing things to help people to the best of our ability. But Buddhas have perfected that state, and that state of mind. So when we're going for refuge to the Buddha, the way I like to think of it is that we're getting protection or shelter or solace from this idea that that there's a state of mind or a realization of reality that allows us to permanently end our suffering, and to also be in a better position to help people through teaching and the kinds of small actions that we can do throughout our day, interpersonally. Then the second of the three jewels is the Dharma. And we go for refuge to the Dharma by knowing that there is a methodology that Buddha and the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas have left behind for us, like an instruction manual. We're fortunate that we know that such an instruction manual exists, that we have access to it, that we have the faculties to be able to read and to learn, that we have the time and space in our lives to practice meditation, that we can take actions in our life to change our circumstances. And the Dharma is the instruction manual. And there's not just one path. Within Buddhism, there's many different approaches to this. And so the Dharma is not just that there's one instruction manual or like a playbook that we can follow, but that wherever we're at, we have access to some kind of teaching or some kind of practice that helps us change the trajectory of our life. And the third of the three jewels is the Sangha. And the Sangha is, when we take refuge in the Sangha, I think of this in two ways. One is that the Sangha is all of the people, subsequent to the historical Buddha, Siddhartha Gautama, who have put these techniques into practice, who have done these experiments, these thought experiments, and changed the way that their mind is working. In other words, that the results are replicable. They don't just exist one time like Gautama wasn't just an outlier who was the one and only guy who figured this out, but rather that many people over thousands of years have put Buddha's teachings into practice and had the same kinds of results, and have left behind their instructions and their ideas and their thoughts, their innovations for us to use. And the other form of the Sangha is that we have a lot of people in our lives who are supporting us. We have, we were talking about how we're in like our virtual Gompa right now, but everyone who's here and participates in a Buddhist community are all part of our Sangha. And I think that Sangha also includes all of the people in our lives who are supporting us, whether they're following Buddhist methodology or not. We're fortunate that we have friends and family and counselors and mentors, people who are looking out for us, people who we can go to for support and ask for help when we're struggling. And I think of all of that as the Sangha. And so when we're struggling, when we're having a difficult time, we go for refuge to the three jewels. We can remember that we're not in a permanent state, and that we are changeable in kind of a fundamental way. That there's things that we can do. There's always a starting place. The Dharma leaves like the breadcrumbs that we can follow, and that there are people we can reach out to, both for inspiration, teachers and scholars and practitioners, both who are alive now and historical figures, and also people who we can actually like get on the phone and call and have a conversation with when when we need that extra support. So that's how I think of refuge, and I like that. I want to think of it in a practical, pragmatic, accessible way, like something that I can really sink my teeth into. So that's why I take that approach to refuge. The second thing that it's customary to do at the beginning of a Buddhist teaching or practice is to set our motivation. And this is especially true in Mahayana Buddhism, but it's present in all of the forms of Buddhism, where we're trying to, one of the core problems according to Buddhism is selfishness, self-cherishing, to be more specific. That we are kind of obsessed with ourself. And it's not necessarily like in a narcissistic, egocentric kind of way. It's just that by virtue of being embodied, I experience my world and I don't experience your world. And when I stub my toe, it's a big deal. But when you stub your toe, I'm not even aware of it, unless we happen to be in the same room and there's a kerfuffle and then I react to it. But otherwise, I'm not aware of what you're suffering, what your experiences are. I don't know if you're hungry or thirsty or whatever. And so just at a basic level, not at a narcissistic level, but just at a kind of a basic level, like my embodied existence is really important to me, and other people's embodied existences are kind of like distant and abstract and sort of they exist as ideas, but unless I am really close to somebody, then other people kind of don't exist. Other than as like something I'm interacting with. But I'm me and everything else is just sort of out there, sort of like a hazy cloud of a hypothetical other. And that's a fundamental flaw in our thinking, according to Buddhism, that basic level of selfishness is one of the main roots of our problem, because it doesn't take into account the fundamental interconnected nature of all life and of all phenomena. That all beings, all life forms, seen and unseen, have a basic equivalent validity. Everyone's life is equally valid in a basic kind of way, as conscious beings to the various degrees that beings are conscious. An insect has a different consciousness than a human being does, but within Buddhism, the suffering that an insect experiences is no less valid than the suffering that a human being experiences. And so my self-cherishing, my basic selfishness, is a fundamental misunderstanding of the nature of life, the nature of consciousness. And that fundamental misunderstanding is what's driving, one of the things that's driving the craving and aversion. That I want things that are going to make me happy and comfortable, and I'm not that interested in what is going to make other people comfortable and happy, and I want to get rid of the things that irritate me, and I'm not really that concerned about the things that irritate you or make you uncomfortable. And that misunderstanding is preventing me really from spiritual development and from expanding my consciousness to eliminate ignorance, which is this underlying problem for craving and delusion that's driving the self-cherishing, is the ignorance. So given this, it's important at the beginning of every Buddhist teaching to set our motivation, that while it's valid and relevant to be seeking the end of samsara for myself and nirvana, the permanent end of suffering for myself, it's insufficient as a goal. And the true goal, particularly in Mahayana Buddhism, is to see all beings suffering as equally valid and set the elimination of suffering for all beings as the goal. And according to Buddhism, this is the bodhisattva path. This is the path of altruism, the path of intense compassion. And since that's going to be according to Buddhism, that realization is going to come at a certain level of spiritual development, whether you set it as a goal or not. But that realization will come sooner and have more potency and power in your life and in your spiritual practice if you set it as your goal at the outset. So when we begin a Buddhist teaching or a Buddhist practice, we set our motivation as, I'm doing this not only for my own well-being, but I'm doing it because I want to become someone who is truly capable of helping others, or I have an increasing capacity of being able to help others, up to the ultimate point of a Buddha, which is teaching, helping others identify the roots of their suffering so that they can uproot that for themselves. At the beginning, I said a Buddha doesn't intercede in our behalf. They can't take our suffering away. But what they can do is guide us to identify the suffering in our own self so we can uproot it in our own self. And that's what our goal in Mahayana Buddhism is, to become someone who can teach with such skill that we can, with everyone that we're interacting with, help them see how they can uproot and eliminate suffering in their own life. And that's a lofty goal, but nevertheless, that's what we're setting as our motivation at the outset. So that's refuge and motivation. And I think it's worth taking extra time to look at it at the beginning of a class, because it is kind of the sine qua non. It's like we're setting the foundation for everything else. All of the philosophical study and the textual interpretation and the looking at what the Sanskrit is saying and things like that are all only relevant and valid in a container of refuge and bodhicitta. So in this class series, we're looking at the Heart Sutra. I think it's worth briefly reviewing what we looked at the Heart Sutra in the last class to kind of reset the stage. The beginning of the Heart Sutra is about setting the scene and what's the context of the teaching and why is the teaching taking place. The name of the text is, I want to get it right, Prajna Paramita Hridaya Sutram in Sanskrit. And that's the perfection of wisdom, Prajna Paramita, Heart Sutra, which is where it gets its name. The Hridaya means heart. So when we're saying Prajna Paramita Hridaya Sutram, we're working backwards in the Sanskrit. So it's the sutra on the heart of the perfection of wisdom. Perfection of wisdom is the ultimate elimination of ignorance and the recognition of how the universe is really working, how our perceptual matrix is really working. And that's what the text gets into, and we're going to start looking at that more closely today. We also met our characters. The sutra is, this version of the sutra that I emailed you is doesn't have the customary introduction of a sutra, which begins with "Thus have I heard," and that's Ananda who is narrating the events as he saw them. We're dealing with a shortened version of the Heart Sutra, but we know from the longer version that this takes place on Vulture's Peak in India. The Buddha is in front of the assembly of many monks and nuns and arhats and bodhisattvas and advanced spiritual practitioners. Buddha is deep in meditation. He is practicing the practice of Prajna Paramita. And sitting next to him is one of his chief disciples, Avalokiteshvara, the Lord who hears the cries of the world, the Lord who hears the suffering of the world. You may be familiar with another name for Avalokiteshvara, which is Guanyin, the Chinese version of the same bodhisattva. And Avalokiteshvara is characterized by his or her. Avalokiteshvara is represented either as a male or a female, so there's an androgynous quality. Nevertheless, Avalokiteshvara is represented as having intense compassion, this overwhelming desire to help other people alleviate their suffering, an intense desire to want to free others from samsara. And so Avalokiteshvara is the Lord, or the Bodhisattva. Ishvara means Lord, and Avalokita is looking down upon the world with this evocative metaphor of being able to see the world and see the suffering, all of the suffering in the world, and having this like heartbreaking love and compassion of wanting to intercede and help. So Avalokiteshvara is also in deep meditation. Remember, it describes him as practicing the practice of the perfection of wisdom. The text goes to great lengths to emphasize that the perfection of wisdom is a process, a practice. Practicing the practice of the perfection of wisdom. And so while Gautama Buddha and Avalokiteshvara are deep in meditation, the audience is chilling out, and Shariputra, a question pops into Shariputra's mind. Shariputra is another one of Gautama Buddha's chief disciples, and in many of the sutras, Shariputra is the guy who asks the question. So the Buddha, in the sutras, Buddha almost always responds to a question. Buddha doesn't just launch into a discourse, he's always responding to something that somebody is asking. People approach him because he's this great philosopher, this great scientist of the mind, a psychologist, and his reputation has spread far and wide throughout what is now Nepal and northern India, and people come to find him. He travels around a lot with his band of arhats and monks and nuns, and wherever he goes, people come to see him and ask him for advice. And so there's generally somebody in the audience who has a question for Buddha. And in this sutra, it's Shariputra who is often the one asking the question. And Shariputra wants to know, how should one live their life? How should one think and approach practice if they want to develop the perfection of wisdom? In all of the sutras, Buddha is the one who answers the question. But in the Heart Sutra, Avalokiteshvara answers the question. Buddha doesn't stir from his meditation. He doesn't speak in the sutra until the very, very end. But Avalokiteshvara responds to Shariputra's question. This is crucial because this is a text on wisdom. Prajnaparamita is a philosophical text on wisdom, which is the two wings of Buddhism, right? Wisdom and compassion, and you need both wings need to be equally strong and working in concert in order for the bird to take flight. And so one of these wings is wisdom, Prajnaparamita, and the other wing is compassion. So it's not at all incidental that Avalokiteshvara, the Bodhisattva of compassion, is giving the teaching on Prajnaparamita, on wisdom. That's a mythic quality of this sutra, but it's a very important philosophical point that the teachings on wisdom are coming from the heart of compassion. So this is setting the stage. Buddha and Avalokiteshvara are meditating. There's an uncounted number of spiritual practitioners hanging out, wondering what's happening. Shariputra asks a question: how does one practice the perfection of wisdom? Avalokiteshvara, speaking from within the state of deep meditation, responds to Shariputra's question. And that is the content of this discourse. That's the content of this sutra, is Avalokiteshvara's response. So the response then is that Avalokiteshvara, the line from the Sanskrit is Arya Avalokiteshvaro Bodhisattvo Gambiram Prajna Paramita Charyam Charma no Vyavalokayati Sma. So the noble Avalokiteshvara, the great Bodhisattva, is practicing the practice of Prajna Paramita, and he looks down upon the world, and this is what he says. What he sees is that Panchaskanda, this is the Sanskrit, Panchaskandas tamscha svabhava shunyan pashyati sma. So he hasn't started speaking yet. the text is still telling us what Avalokiteshvara is seeing, what Avalokiteshvara experiences from within Prajnaparamita as his meditative state. The Sanskrit Pancha Skanda, that means the 5 skandhas. Skandhas is a very interesting word in Sanskrit, and it doesn't readily translate into English and kind of capture the spirit or the meaning of what the skandhas are. We'll get into the skandhas later, but for a shorthand, the skandhas are, the word skandha means something like heap or aggregate. These are English words that you'll hear if people are talking about the skandhas. The skandhas are sort of psychological and physical faculties, characteristics of consciousness and perception and the world that, taken in total, create a person's being. The skandhas are form, physicality, sensation, perception, volition, and consciousness itself. And we'll talk about that more because it comes up later in the text. But for now, what we need to know. This is one of the tricky things about the Heart Sutra as a text. This is just a brief aside. Is that there's a lot of technical terminology, a lot of Buddhist technical terms in this very short text. One of the reasons I like it and that I wanted to teach it here is that it's kind of a condensed shorthand for a great deal of Buddhist philosophical ideas. But that in order to really get the text, it assumes that you already know what those ideas are. So right here, where it just sort of mentions the 5 skandhas, that's not very helpful unless you already have a sense of what the skandhas are and how they operate and what it means in Buddhism. And in about 2 lines, he mentions those, and we'll go into them. He lists them, and he goes into it there. But there's several places in this sutra where they mention things in Buddhist philosophy that have a great deal of encoded information in them. And so this sutra is based on the assumption that you're already working with a pretty solid idea of what a lot of Buddhist technical terminology means. And so one of the things that I want to do in this class is look at that technical terminology and kind of unpack it, describe what it means and what it's saying in Buddhism. And then we go one step further because the Heart Sutra then negates that. And that negation is very important. It's one of the things that makes the Heart Sutra a controversial text in Buddhist philosophy, because it takes Buddhist philosophy and says a lot of it isn't real or isn't accurate. And so for some Buddhist sects, that was seen as an attack. It's like a philosophical attack on what they believe Buddha is saying and what Buddhism means. So this idea that Prajnaparamita comes in and negates a lot of philosophical ideas that are well established in Buddhism, it makes it a challenging text intentionally. The Heart Sutra is trying to be a challenging text, meaning that it's attacking what old school Buddhists would be holding on to as what they think Buddhism means. But it pretty much goes right into 5th gear, because it says the Pancha Skandhas are Svabhava Shunyan. So here's a couple of our really big key words in Buddhism. Svabhava and Shunya, or usually we hear Shunyata. So Shunyan means empty or void, possessing nothing, non-existent from the Sanskrit. And Shunyata makes it a process. It like ta in Sanskrit is like adding ness to an English word. So similarly, we have shunyan, empty, shunyata, emptiness. So that gives it a process orientation. But in this verse, where he's introducing this term shunya, he's simply saying that the svabhava is empty. Now, svabhava is another key word in Buddhism, because this is a thing that Buddha goes to great lengths to attack, even in the early sutras, before the Mahayana sutras come on the scene, or the Prajnaparamita sutras come on the scene. The svabhava means self-nature. Bhava meaning being. So one of the reasons I want to work from the Sanskrit, sorry, another slight aside, one of the reasons I want to work from the Sanskrit for this text is that Sanskrit words have a lot of possible meanings, and they take on different tone depending on the context that they're in. So whenever we choose to translate a Sanskrit word as one English word, we are maybe missing other possible connotations or usages of that Sanskrit word. So that's why I wanted to work from the Sanskrit and talk about many of the different possible translations for these words, because I think it's helpful for us to have a more kind of broad scope or kind of holographic understanding of what the text is saying, rather than reading it in English and just immediately imposing one possible translation out of many. So we hear this word svabhava. It's usually translated as self-nature. If you hang around in Buddhist philosophical circles, you'll hear the term self-nature quite a lot, or self-existence. Bhava is this word for existence, or existing. It can also mean becoming. So bhava has an emergent quality. In other contexts, it can mean rebirth. So in the sort of Indian philosophical system that Buddhism emerges from, this idea that we're in the process of rebirth is largely accepted. Not universally accepted, but it's largely accepted, that we're going through a process of rebirth. When our physical body dies, our what we think of ourself is dispersed, but our consciousness is reborn in a new body, as a new type of creature, a new type of being. Sometimes that's a human being, but it's not taken for granted that we'll be reborn as a human being. So the process of rebirth is not necessarily progressive. This is a common idea that we find Western philosophy, the Western worldview tends to be progressive, that we're sort of on a linear path from a less sophisticated world to a more sophisticated world. We're moving from a more primitive world to a more technological world. We're moving from a more kind of regressed, kind of conservative worldview to a more progressive liberal worldview. And there's sort of like the steady march of history as it moves from prehistory into, and there's always the possibility of this utopic future that's just around the corner. And sometimes when we encounter the idea of rebirth, we ascribe this Western philosophical idea of progression to it, that your next rebirth is necessarily going to be better than your last rebirth because things are just kind of getting better. We're progressing. But Buddhism and Buddhist philosophy would not agree with that we're in a cycle that continues until we learn how to interrupt the cycle. And our rebirth is characterized by the choices that we make in our life. The type of mind that we cultivate, the way that we treat other beings. This is karma. The way that we treat others is what creates the karma that is going to lead to our future life, our future rebirth. So this word bhava has this connotation of rebirth. So it's not just, bhava doesn't just mean like you who you think you are right now, this body and this mind. The self-nature that is shunyan, that is empty, includes the whole rebirth process. And another way of looking at bhava, being or nature, is the heart or the soul. the seat of our feelings. So this self nature, svabhava, has a broad range of possible meanings. And it's also, it's the word svabhava is really kind of, again, it's kind of driving home a point, like practicing the practice of the perfection of wisdom, which bhava already means being. It already means existing. So svabhava is like self-existing, self-nature, that the being that it has is intrinsic to its being. It's really driving home a point that what we're attacking is this idea that we have that the thing really exists, that it has a tangibility, a permanence, that we kind of reflexively believe that it has. Like I was talking earlier about my sort of basic self-conception, where I'm me and everything else is just sort of a vague out there. All other beings are just sort of like, I kind of understand in principle that you exist, but like I know that I exist because I experience my existing, but I don't experience your existing. That me experiencing my existing is my reflexive assumption of my self-nature. Like I really believe I exist because I just know it. I can, like, it's like this visceral, immediate knowing that my self-nature is real. Other words for this that you will encounter, or another major one that you'll encounter is Atman. And in Buddhist philosophy, or in Buddhist texts, they'll call it An-Atman, which the An is the negation. So An-Atman, the non-self. And the word Atman is often translated into English as self, or kind of a beingness. But in Buddha's time, Atman had a technical term in the other Hindu religions that were quite predominant at the time, which was that we have a corporeal soul, that we have a sort of subtle physical soul. And there was a philosophical school that had a lot of traction in those days, that what was going through the rebirth process was this corporeal soul, this sort of physical essence of yourself. And even if your memories are wiped between your rebirth process, that there's like a physical part of you that's being reborn. And so that's another thing that that Buddhism is, that's another kind of svabhava term that Buddhism is pretty direct in attacking. So, so Buddha is saying this svabhava, or I guess it's Avalokiteshvara who's experiencing this in this story, in this text. We're seeing Avalokiteshvara's experience. Avalokiteshvara looks down, sees the world, looks down upon the world, sees all of the beings in the world, and he sees that the 5 skandhas, the various characteristics that make up their existence, are empty or absent or are lacking or don't have a svabhava, a self-nature. And there's another word in this line, pashyati, and pashya means beholding or rightly understanding. So as long as we're going through the Sanskrit, we can go through almost all the words. So panchaskanda tamscha svabhava shunyan pashyati sma. He rightly beholds, he correctly sees the self-nature of the 5 skandhas are empty. So I think it's worth here taking a little more time to talk about what it means to say something is empty of self-nature, because the Buddhist texts talk about it in a variety of different ways, and they're not, different Buddhist texts and different genres of Buddhist texts talk about it in different ways. So they don't always give this kind of grocery list of what emptiness means. But some of the different possibilities of what it means to say something is empty of self-nature or void of self-nature. We hear this word like emptiness is a fairly accurate translation from Sanskrit into English, or voidness. You'll also see voidness pretty common in translations of Buddhist texts. But it's difficult from those words to get a sense of what emptiness means. Voidness sounds like, outer space when there's no stars and no light and no planets, and it's just like this infinite blackness or something like that. And that's not at all what emptiness is talking about. It's not talking about that there's nothing there. It's not saying that there's nothing there. It's saying that the thing that we think is there, the thing that we reflexively believe is there, is a misunderstanding. And that's what emptiness is really trying to get at, and what this text is really trying to get at. So some of the ways that Buddha and Buddhist texts talk about emptiness, one of the main ones is impermanence, that we think of things as being enduring. And when we really sit down and think about it, we know that our car is going to break down eventually. We know that at any point you could drop a plate while you're washing dishes and it would break, and it's not permanent in that sense. But in our kind of moment-to-moment reflexive way of looking, of experiencing the world, the things seem to us to have an enduring existence to them. For example, when I put my teacup on my nightstand, I assume it's going to be there when I wake up in the morning. And that's my unquestioning faith in its svabhava, in its self-nature. Like the cup, it just exists. But Buddhism is trying to get us to think about it at a deeper level, which is that things are always impermanent, but we are perceiving them as not impermanent because we're imposing our understanding of them as permanent on them. Oh, that's a word salad, isn't it? Another way of looking at it is that things are not under our control. That if things, here's the kind of the way that Buddhism attacks what we think of as permanence, as svabhava, the self-nature to a thing, is if it had a self-nature, if the teacup on my nightstand had a self-nature, it couldn't possibly break because it would be under my control. It would be permanent, unchanging. Its essence of teacup would be its self-nature. And it couldn't possibly break because it would be under my control, because I'm perceiving it as having the self-nature of teacup. Excuse me. In fact, here's the teacup I'm talking about. It has a picture of a Buddha on the bottom, see? My favorite teacup. There's only one of them. It has self-nature. I know because it's in my hand right now and it can't ever break. No, that's incorrect. That's the self-nature. That's not there. So other ways of looking at emptiness, or other ways of looking at the self-nature that's not there. The way that I perceive something, the way that any of us perceive something, anything, everything, is a quality of our perception, not a quality of the object. If the teacup had self-nature, it couldn't be anything other than a teacup to anyone who perceived it. So if my cat comes into the room, I don't have a cat, but if I did and my cat came into the room, the cat would not necessarily see this as a teacup. The cat wouldn't look at this as, oh, this is Mojo's special teacup, his favorite teacup. The cat wouldn't have any perception of that. They might have a perception of it as something that's holding a liquid, but probably the cat's not going to want to drink my strong black tea. So it's not going to see it as a teacup. We can take these examples with anything. Take a musical instrument. I have a ukulele right over there. My cat's not going to see a ukulele as a musical instrument. The The quality of the ukulele as a musical instrument is a quality of my perception, not a quality of the object. And someone who doesn't know how to play a ukulele is going to perceive it as very different than somebody who does know how to play a ukulele. Someone who knows how to play it, somebody who knows how to play it better than I do, is going to see it as something that's capable of producing beautiful sounds. Somebody who doesn't know how to play it is going to perceive it as, maybe having the potential to do that, but that's not what it doesn't have that immediate visceral meaning to them. Those two people perceive the same object very differently. And so we're labeling things not in a conscious way, not where I'm looking at the teacup and saying, oh, this is teacup, and the cat looks at the teacup and doesn't see it as a teacup, maybe because they don't have the language to call it a teacup. But even at a more subtle level than that we're continually reflexively seeing things as having the self-nature of what our perceptual apparatus, forced by our karma, is, demanding that we see it as. Another way of putting it is, I can't look at the teacup and then say, oh no, that's not a teacup, that's a shoehorn or a doorknob, right? I can't just perceive it as different than I perceive it. I can't just take the label off and put a new label on. That labeling is the self-nature of the thing, the falsely existing self-nature of the thing. That reflexive automatic labeling is my perception of its self-nature, which is not there. Okay, I think those of you who have been through the emptiness class ringer before know that this is something you can think about and contemplate and talk about a lot and not ever really quite get to the bottom of it. So I don't want to get too exhausted. This whole text is about emptiness, so it comes at the same problem from different angles. And so for right now, we just want to get kind of a working definition of the lack of self-nature, the self-nature that is empty, that the fact that the objects, the text is starting with the skandhas, which is pretty interesting because the skandhas are mostly psychological qualities of consciousness, that the things that we think have a self-nature are empty of a self-nature. We just need to start having like kind of a way to work with that, a way to kind of chew on that as we go forward. Because it keeps going. That's not the end. It keeps going. This next line is the famous line from the Heart Sutra. And if you've heard the Heart Sutra, this is the one that is the standout line. This is Avalokiteshvara speaking to Shariputra and the audience. In Sanskrit, he says, Iha Shariputra Rupam shunyata shunyataiva rupam rupa napritak shunyata shunyataya napritak rupam yad rupam sa shunyata ya shunyata tad rupam. So there's a lot of rupas and a lot of shunyatas in that sentence. But it's the relationship that is important here, which is in English. Here he's setting up one of the major logical proofs that he's going to use, that he wants you to take this logical proof and apply it over and over and over again to all of the different things that we attack or deconstruct in this text. Form is emptiness, and emptiness is form. Form is none other than emptiness. Emptiness is none other than form. Whatever is emptiness, that is form. Whatever is form, that is emptiness. So this is kind of ripping the bandage off, because it's not enough to say that the svabhava is shunya. He has to go further and say form itself. He's starting with form, but he's going to apply this to many different things. Form means our physical body. This is the first of the 5 skandhas, the pancha skandhas. Form means our physical body, but it also means the principle of physicality, the entire physical world, everything that we interact with that we're interacting with as physical objects, all of that is form. So in this kind of Buddhist construction of the mind, the Buddhist construction of yourself, of your being, form is not limited to your own body. Everything that you see and interact with is technically your form. The form of the world is your own body, your physical being, but is also everything that you touch and interact with. And that's how physicality is categorized from this philosophical perspective within Buddhism, because there's a lot of different approaches. But from here, when we're talking about the Panchaskandhas, the 5 skandhas, all form is basically your body, the physical world. Your body is not distinguished from other physical objects from the perspective of the principle of form. So he's saying form is emptiness. Not form has emptiness, but form is emptiness, and emptiness is form. That's tricky, because here he's saying it's not just that physical things are empty of self-nature. It's that the emptiness of the self-nature of the thing is the thing. And emptiness only exists as the emptiness of the thing that's empty of self-nature. Form is not other than emptiness, and emptiness is not other than form. There's no form that's not empty of self-nature. And there's no absence of self-nature except for the things that are empty of self-nature. Whatever is emptiness, that is form. Whatever is form, that is emptiness. So he's putting it to us 4 different ways. Form is emptiness. Emptiness is form. Maybe 3 different pairs. Form is emptiness, and emptiness is form. Form is not other than emptiness, and emptiness is not other than form. Whatever is form, that is emptiness, and whatever is emptiness, that is form. So this is one of the closest things that we find in Buddhist sutras where they are defining emptiness in as clear a way as they can. Now, we're talking about form, but Avalokiteshvara goes on to say this is also true of sensation, of perception, of volition, of consciousness, and he goes on from there. But he sets up this, I was going to call it a dichotomy, but it's really an absence of a dichotomy, where he's saying these things that we can't take form, we can't take existing things, which I'm putting air quotes around existing things. We can't take existing things without taking the emptiness of the existing thing, the lack of self-nature of the existing thing. The existing thing is its absence of self-nature. And absence of self-nature is the existing thing. And they don't exist in any way other than that. They only exist as their absence of self-nature. So one of the things I was talking about last week, which I think is worth revisiting here, is how do we use the text as a practice manual? And this is one of the primary ways that we use the text as a practice manual. This is not, I mean, this is something I can explain to you what the text says, and I can give you some different ways of approaching this puzzle. But we have to do the thought experiment in our own meditative process. We can puzzle through it by thinking about it. We can assess it and evaluate it and sort of run through what these things mean. But we also have to like bake it in at a deeper level in order to produce what's called a realization. This is like the two main branches of meditation practice, shamatha and vipassana. And shamatha is developing meditative concentration, right? I don't know if you can see this thing behind me, the stages of meditation, the elephant and the monkey and the monk. Maybe you've seen that image before. It's the classical Tibetan instruction manual for developing shamatha, which is a high degree of concentration, single-pointed concentration, the ability to hold your mind on an object and on a subtle object for long periods of time. But then shamatha, it's sister science, it's sister to meditation of shamatha is vipassana, which is insight, realization, transformative awakening experiences that change the way that your consciousness works. So this line, form is emptiness, emptiness is form. Form is not other than emptiness. Emptiness is not other than form. Whatever is form, whatever is emptiness, whatever is form, that is emptiness. Whatever is emptiness, that is form. That's something that we need to meditate on deeply until we can have, experiences of realization of what it means. And I think that's one of the main ways that this text can be used as a practice text. And it goes on, and of course, we have 4 more classes after this one where we'll go into these ideas more deeply and apply it in different ways to different aspects of our consciousness, aspects of our existence, different ways of looking at how reality is working, and then seeing how emptiness fits within these frameworks for how reality is working. But we need to stay with form is emptiness and emptiness is form. Because that's kind of a crucial understanding to develop as we're working on developing prajna paramita, perfection of wisdom. So I think we'll wrap up shortly, take a break, and then come back for some discussion. But just a moment before we do that, we're going to, just to set up what we're going to do next, where the text goes next. He goes into the 5 skandhas, which I've mentioned today, and we're going to go through each of those and talk about what they are and how they work together to create a self, a person. But we're going to go through the 5 skandhas, but then we're also going to look at how this text is applying this concept of emptiness to the 5 skandhas. He gets into a pretty interesting discussion of how instances of consciousness have the characteristic mark of emptiness. That's the lakshana. Lakshana is a complex concept, Sanskrit word that doesn't have an easy translation, and I've even seen texts where English translations, where the author chooses different English words for the Sanskrit word lakshana, and so you're going through this text and he's using all these different words to describe what's one Sanskrit word. Lakshana is a pretty interesting concept. And we're going to look at more of the characteristics of emptiness according to the Heart Sutra. And then I think that's probably what we're going to do. That's what the next class will be. And then we get further into sense perception, how sense perception works, how we think it's working, but also how it's really working according to Buddhist kind of the sort of Buddhist neuroscience. I'm putting that in air quotes because that's not really fair to claim that Buddhism is making the same assertions of neuroscience, but we're going to look at how the sense organs work according to Buddhism, and then it also gets into the 12 links of dependent origination, and the Four Noble Truths. So this is kind of the greatest hits. This text has like the greatest hits of early Buddhist philosophical treatise. But one of the things that the text is doing, as I mentioned earlier, is that it's attacking these Buddhist ideas. It's attacking Buddhist philosophy. So the Heart Sutra takes this corpus of Buddhist literature, the Buddhist sutras and Buddhist philosophy on Abhidharma, and then turns that whole thing on its ear and says, here's how all of that's not true. And goes into why that is, which we started today with the form is emptiness and emptiness is form thing. And then later on we talk about the realization of nirvana and how to practice prajnaparamita. So that's kind of the preview of what's left in the text. Now it's also customary, before we end, to do a dedication of merit. This is how Buddhist teachings and practices, customarily how we sort of close and have like a resolution. The dedication of merit is, first of all, that we are setting recognition, noticing that we are making this a priority in our life, that studying Dharma and practicing Dharma is a priority in our life, that we're doing this to become better for others, to increase our capacities of compassion and altruism, our capacity for kindness. Even though the Heart Sutra is largely a wisdom text, it is still trying to get us deeper into our kindness and our compassion, and give us a strong recognition for why that's important, why it's necessary, why it's crucial. So taking the time to study this, to contemplate it, to meditate on these things is a powerful activity. And so we want to dedicate that to the well-being of others, living in a more peaceful, sane, caring society, for starters. And because Buddhism has this framework for future rebirths that are driven by our karmic processes, that dedicating the merit is a way of investing the good karma that we've developed by studying and practicing Dharma, and investing it towards a certain kind of goal. And customarily, we dedicate the karma to the well-being of others. If I could, or I can visualize that the merit that I've generated here be planted in the hearts of other beings, that I could kind of replicate it, and the karma, instead of getting planted in my own karmic mind stream, that I can like duplicate it and plant it in the hearts of everybody else, so that they have the positive results. I'm willing to sacrifice the positive results for myself, so that other beings, other people can have the results. They need it more than I do, so give it away. And that actually makes it ripen faster, and makes the karma ripen more powerfully. So we just recall that we want others to be happy. We want them to be free of suffering, and that's why we're doing this, and that's what we're dedicating our efforts to.